Welcome everybody to History Room Live. This is a program of the Saginaw History and Genealogy Room at Patent Free Library. We present this program weekly in an effort to maintain connections to our patrons who may not be able to visit us in the library. And we love our Friday afternoon meetings, so thank you all for being here. Today's program is sponsored by Edward Jones, which is appropriate because those folks are located in the Custom House, which is the topic of today's presentation. Today we have Nathan Lipfert, Curator Emeritus of the Maine Maritime Museum and past president of the Bath Historical Society. He's been a dedicated attendee of these programs. And so I'm very, very pleased that he's volunteered to be a presenter because I know him as, one of the most knowledgeable historians around. I think some of you would agree with me on that, although Nathan is making a face. So the title of this presentation is Working in the Bath Custom House, A History, and I will let you tell us the rest, Nathan.
Okay. Let's see here. So there is a building in Bath that provides us with the closest connection we have to the people who tried to provide government oversight to the region's once bustling maritime industry. Wow. There we go. Today, you can still walk in the north door of the building that we call the Custom House, go up the cast iron stairs to the second floor and cross the hall towards the door that's labeled Customs Room, just as a shipmaster or shipyard owner did 100 years ago. But it has been more than 40 years since anyone has done that on official business. And little or nothing remains of the workspaces once occupied by federal employees. So I've been having fun recently trying to reconstruct the experiences of the folks who worked here and in earlier customs buildings. So to begin, let's define the term. Custom refers to the duties, tolls, or imposts imposed by the sovereign law of a country on imports or exports. And it's usually used in the plural. So customs are equal duties. And then usually used in the singular, it can refer to the agency, establishment, or procedure for collecting such customs. So we have a collector of customs and we have a custom house. But then we have a customs district, so it's not consistent. And we just have to learn what the routine is. There were about a dozen customs districts in Maine. Some of them came and went. This was one of the first things that our federal government did in the process of inventing itself was to establish a customs service, because this was a source of income, which the country had very little of in the early years. The Bath district, as you may notice here, the district includes Bath itself, but also all the towns up and down the Kennebec River and Brunswick and Topsham and Harpswell. Bath is the port of entry. That's where the custom house was, and the other towns generally were designated as ports of delivery, where cargoes could be delivered, but only after entering at the custom house. The part that is not clear is that, or is not usually obvious to people, is that up on the north border of the state, there's also a little section of the Bath Customs District. The Bath District was responsible for the Canada Road, which was access to Maine and to the United States from Canada, from Quebec, entering through the town we now call Jackman. So there were customs employees stationed at a place called Moose River, at the Forks, at the Canada line, and that was all in the Jackman area. But that customs officer reported to Bath and was on the list of Bath employees. Also, for a time, were people stationed at Beatty and Lowelltown, which are unincorporated towns, which is where the railroad comes in from Megantic in Quebec. That was a station that was part of it. And the other Maine districts also had sections of the northern border that they were responsible for. So what happened in a customs house? There were a number of activities, indoor activities and outdoor activities. We see, well, here's the list: measuring and documenting new vessels, inspecting and redocumenting older vessels, providing documents to mariners, documenting voyages, inspecting cargoes, charging and receiving duties on imported goods, and management of the cod fishing bounty during certain years. So this was a certain amount of, indoor work and actually a whole lot of outdoor work. There would be a boat stationed at the lower stretches of the river, and incoming vessels would be met by a boarding officer who would take a duplicate manifest of the inbound foreign cargoes. He would put locks on the hatches until time came to discharge cargo, which would happen under inspection. And when the cargo was discharged, sample containers would be examined, opened, weighed, or otherwise looked into. And that's the same sort of thing that happens now when a big container ship comes into a port. One or two, a sample of the containers get opened and checked into. Unfortunately for us, the one image we have that shows the inside of the customs office is this one taken just a couple years before the office was closed for good. But it does show an interesting thing. This is in the upstairs of the building that we call the old post office or the old customs house, old custom house. The sign actually outside might say customs house. Anyway, you can see the door here that the captains or the ship owners or the shipyard owners would come in, and they would be sort of penned inside this big counter here. And the other side of that counter looks nicer than this side that we're looking at. We see all the dozens and dozens of little drawers. Each drawer contains a pile of forms, blank forms that could be filled out for some particular reason. And there also are some tambour slides on this side over here to the right that are lockable, so that important documents could be locked away. inside those slides. This house, or this office, was closed for good just a couple years after this picture was taken. Here's an example of one of those incoming manifests. This is a 1797 manifest for the schooner Orange, arriving in Bath from Demerara. And it's just a list of the cargo items that were aboard the vessel. And so that's part of documenting a voyage. Either for incoming or outgoing cargoes, you need a manifest. You need a signed crew agreement, signed by all the crew members. Sometimes the captain was responsible for turning over the seaman's time books to be signed by the director, the customs collector. These were documenting the fees that were being paid by the ship towards the Marine Hospital Service. There was a health certification. You've heard of a bill of health. Well, there was a literal bill of health that had to be issued for incoming vessels. A doctor went aboard and inspected the crew and made sure they hadn't come from a fever port or some such. There was a special document for entering the port and a special document for clearing or leaving the port. And after 1820, or after 1819 actually, it was required to file a passenger list if there were passengers aboard. But Bath obviously was not a big port for passenger arrivals. Some of the documents are very interesting to us today in an aggregate sense. Here's an abstract of clearances for foreign voyages leaving from Bath. These are all the vessels, and there's 19 of them, that left Bath in the month of October of 1839, all bound for foreign places. And all of the places that they're bound for are in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico. And you'll notice a couple of places that we don't think of today as foreign places, but in 1839 they were. Documenting mariners simply meant the issuing of a form of passport called a Seaman's Protection Certificate. You had to arrive at the customs house and present your proof of citizenship, a birth certificate, or somebody that the collector knew who could swear that you were born in his town. And then the collector would sign this thing and you would fold it up and carry it in your wallet for the rest of your career. Documenting vessels. A new vessel needed to have a certificate of construction signed by the master carpenter or the shipyard owner. And then you had to document your vessel according to what it was going to be used for. Vessels in foreign trade had to fill out registration forms. Vessels in coastal trade within the U.S. had to fill out enrollment forms. Small vessels under 20 tons and engaged in fishing or coastal trade had to fill out a license form. Ad measurement was an important thing. This was the determination of the size of the vessel. So the customs official had to go to the shipyard and measure the interior of the vessel to determine its volume, which was how a vessel was taxed and rated. After 1865, there was a big deal about the assignment of the official number. Every vessel, and then every time the vessel changed captain, which for some vessels was quite frequently, the new captain had to come down to the post office and sign an oath promising to be a good captain. There's the assignment of the official number. There's a blank copy of the master carpenter's certificate, certificate of enrollment on the left, and certificate of registry on the right. Lots of good detail about the vessel here if you're interested in ships like me. One very interesting thing here is the complete list of all the owners or shareholders in the vessel, which could be 50 or more people for big vessels. And it lists their names individually and the fraction of the ship that they own and their place, their town of residence, so that they could be properly taxed for this. And the ag measurement documents is in this period. There's a little booklet that the inspector brings with him, makes all the interior measurements for the hull of the vessel, and computes the gross tonnage. This is for a small vessel, a 29-foot sloop. So you can imagine for a big vessel, it'd be a lot more dimensions and figuring. The collectors, the collectors were all men. We'll get that out there, and they were typically successful businessmen, usually from Bath or one of the adjoining towns, occasionally from a little bit further away. Their business did not need to be maritime related. There were a few lawyers in the group, and from a foundry and so forth. Are you still hearing me?
Yes.
Nod, Jill, if you can hear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. A number of them had served in the legislature, and they were all politically active guys. This was a political appointment, a presidential appointment, and so they had to be they had to have chosen a side, a political party, and a president of that party would appoint them. And their appointments typically lasted the 4 years that the president was in office, and occasionally they lasted longer, always. And their income was substantial. They were paid a portion of the fees that were the income of the district. And so in the 1830s, early 1830s, General King was receiving over $2,000 a year, which was a major piece of change in the 1830s, and it was a pretty good salary in the 1930s. So we don't worry about them being poor. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the early collectors. One of them is this guy, Joshua Wingate Jr. He was a lawyer from Hallowell, a Harvard graduate, and he had caught the attention of a Revolutionary War hero, General Henry Dearborn, who lived in Gardner. And when Dearborn became the Secretary of War for President Jefferson, he brought Wingate to Washington with him for a nice position in the War Department. And Wingate married Dearborn's daughter, Julia. And later in 1806, Wingate was appointed collector of customs at Bath by Thomas Jefferson. And he remained collector of customs through 1819. So it's a very interesting period. A lot going on there. The embargo, the Non-Intercourse Act, the War of 1812, the entire war. So he was there for some exciting times, and including during the embargo, when part of the job was to keep vessels in. He had to equip and outfit and man a cutter, an armed cutter, to patrol the river. And he's also believed to have built this chest, which was big enough at the time to contain all the records of the district. And it was intended to be hauled out of town in the case of a British attack. And it was used once, actually, during the Panic of 1814, and a panic without a cause. The British never came, actually, that time. But the chest survives. And Joshua and Julia lived in the house at the top of Washington Street Hill, on the east side, the house where the CHR Realty offices used to be, and a lot of important social events happened there. And afterwards, he was succeeded as collector by his brother Joseph. Another guy early on was Mark Langdon Hill. This is the man from Phippsburg for whom the Spite House was, who the Spite House was built to spite. He carried on his stepfather's lumbering, farming, and shipping activities, and became famous for his public service. By the age of 40, he had become Phippsburg's first postmaster, a special justice, a judge of the common pleas, and chief justice of the Court of Sessions. He was also a representative to the U.S. Congress for a time. In many activities, he was associated with General William King of Bath, and both of them being influential in arranging for the separation of Maine from Massachusetts. Hill suffered politically from that because of the local unpopularity in Phippsburg of the Missouri Compromise. In 1824, Hill and General King were both backing a man named William Crawford for president against John Quincy Adams. And during that time, Hill was appointed collector of customs at Bath to replace Joseph Wingate. And Hill, and King and Wingate and some other folks in town became the subject of a controversy. They were accused of collaborating with and trading with the enemy during the War of 1812 and making trading voyages during the Non-Intercourse Act period when they were supposed to be staying at home. And of course, Crawford was not elected president. John Quincy Adams was, and when he, as president, heard about this brouhaha in Bath, he sent a committee to investigate. And they didn't like what they found. They determined that Hill was not their guy, and he was removed from office. And Hill's public career was essentially over by that act. There were a number of places in Bath that were designated as custom houses. None of them are places that I can show you a picture of, a good picture at any rate. There was an early customs facility at Abergagasset Point in Bodenham for a few years, and then there was the first customs collector at Bath. Actually lived in this house at the place where the patent-free library is today, and he had his customs office in a building across Front Street right on the wharves there for a number of years. After that, it was sent. Another collector established a facility at the corner of Washington Street and Center Street, roughly where Washington House is today. And so it was there for 19 years or so. And then in the 1820s, on Broad Street here, there was a little brick building in behind where Bath Savings is today. That was a customs office for a few years. Here's an early list of everybody that was employed at Bath in the customs service. It was in 1825 when Hill briefly was the collector, and this is J.B. Swanton, who replaced Hill, already earning $1,800 a year, pretty darn good. And then batch of inspectors, surgeon of the Marine Hospital, and kind of a mystery guy, a steward. I'm not sure what a steward did unless the cutter that met incoming vessels was big enough to have a cook space, galley, and a cook. And it might have been this guy, Nathan Covell. He was the only guy who was ever rated as a steward that any list I've been able to find. And then a batch of boatmen who were the crew for the boat. William King is a big story unto himself. He, of course, is a well-known businessman. Built a lot of vessels, not himself, but caused to be built a lot of vessels in Brunswick and Topsham and Bath and Woolwich. Some of them in his own shipyard, most in other places. When he moved to Bath in 1800, he opened a store. He bought or built wharves and warehouses. He was active in the shipping and trading business. He bought a lot of real estate, and he opened Bath's first bank. He represented Bath in the Massachusetts legislature. He was quite well known as a military man in the militia. He was a major general of the Maine militia, very active during the War of 1812. And he was known for the rest of his life as General King. A few days before he died, he was asked how far his command extended in 1812. And he said, from Portsmouth to the end of the arrangement. So we're guessing that means the whole coast of Maine. And he, of course, became Maine's first governor. He's very active in making Maine a separate state. And there's a heroic statue of him, whether he was heroic or not. I guess he thought he was, people thought he was. The statue is one of the two main statues in the U.S. Capitol building. Governor King, General King, built this building in 1809, 1810, and it became Bath's first bank, appropriately enough called Bath Bank. The bank was chartered in 1812. And when President Andrew Jackson appointed King as customs collector, he moved the customs office to his office upstairs in this bank. So actually the bank was there during the Panic of 1814. I picture King as leaning out of one of these upstairs windows where his office was, and shouting orders to his militia officers on the street below. Somebody recorded him as doing that during that time. But for the customs office, I think this door here on the left was the way in, and probably there was a stairway just inside that door that went upstairs to the customs office. So King became collector in 1829. He left that position in 1834, and in 1834 the federal government bought this building so that the customs office stayed there for a number of years. And people in town referred to it, it's on maps, as the customs house. even though there always was a bank downstairs. And but it did, the customs office stayed there until 1858, when the official government federal building basically was ready for occupancy. Here's another listing from 1849 of all the employees at that time. This collector, John C. Humphreys, was from Brunswick, actually. And I noticed that when he was collector here, he did not bring his family to Bath to live. That was, people paid attention. But some of his children actually came to Bath later to live, and his wife was from Bath. But in any case, he served for his 4 years, and he was out earlier in 1849, and his replacement, Benjamin Randall, took his place before June of 1849. You'll see there's people here that are paid by a portion of the fees charged by the district. There's people paid an annual salary, and there's people paid a per diem amount, including the three boatmen down here. There's a number of these guys, Edward Neely, James Wakefield, James Nichols, are young men at this time in 1849. Each of them would become collector at some point in future years. And there's another man on this list, Joseph Sewell, who had been a collector a number of years before, and now he's taken a step down as just an inspector. And then one more important guy on the list, Moses Springer, is an inspector in 1849. By 1852, he will become the superintendent of the construction of the new building. So he has an important role to play. Edward St. John Neely is one of a rare example of the lifetime federal employee amongst the folks in Bath. He was the guy who was employed in the customs office the longest. He was appointed by Joseph Sewell in 1837 as an inspector, and he stayed there for 44 years until he died in 1881. He did rise to be a collector in the period 1866 to 81. That's 50 years, longer than anybody else except the first guy, the first collector of customs for Bath, was there for 19 years. That was William Webb. Neely saw the move from the old Bath Bank building to the new customs house, and he was a real active guy in places around Bath, organizations in Bath, including being an officer of the Patent Library Association from its creation, and was influential in the founding of the Patent Free Library. While Neely was an inspector, or perhaps deputy collector, decision was made to build an actual federal building that would contain both the customs office and the post office. And so this whole block at Vine Street and Front Street was purchased, with being two big pieces of property, the General King's house and land, and also a guy named Lambard, for whom Lambard Street is named. and King's house was moved off. I don't know what happened. This other 1851 map shows Lambard had a house on the property too, and there was an engine house, fire station there as well. Don't know what happened to those buildings. But the plans for the building came to Washington. Moses Springer had to adapt them to the location. I'm not going to go, there's all sorts of interesting architectural bits that I could talk about, but we're going to skip through those. This is the size of the building. This is looking at the north side of the building. This door is more or less still there. It never got the balcony overhead that it was supposed to get. The post office was meant to occupy the whole downstairs. In fact, the Board of Trade took over the south side of the building for a few years, the Merchants Exchange. And we're not sure where the stairs actually happened, whether they were in the middle of the building as supposed, because the front door was turned out to be the Front Street side and not the river side. In any case, because other changes were made, we're not sure how the customs upstairs was set up, whether the stairs came up here as they were supposed to have, or whether they were over here by the north door as they are today. But the collector did have a nice big office overlooking the river and seems to have held on to that over the years. Here's what it looked like from the river. The architect down in Washington intended this as the front door, but it never happened because you couldn't really get there because of this big ledge. So they just put a window there instead. And the north door and the west door ended up being the access to the building. In 1905, the newspaper published a description of the selection of a new collector of customs. And this was something I hadn't seen before in a newspaper. The guys are all well-known characters around town. George Moulton was 65 at the time. He was the present collector. He'd been collector since 1897. He was the manager of the foundry and engine works established by his father. He had served in the city council. He had been the mayor of Bath, and he was a Republican. William Rogers was 82. He was a shipbuilder. He'd closed his shipyard just a couple of years earlier after building 100 vessels. He had served in the legislature and on the governor's council. He had never been mayor, but I'm sure he was a Republican too. I don't actually know. John O. Shaw, 67, had been a merchant seaman, became a naval officer during the Civil War, and later established Shaw's Bookstore, which some of us remember downtown, still surviving. He also had been mayor of Bath and was a Republican. Elwell S. Crosby was only 49. He had worked in shipyards and was now a shipbuilder himself and managing owner of a fleet of schooners. He had served in the city council. He had been mayor of Bath, and he was a Republican. You can see the differences between him and the others in the photos. And these are the actual photos that were used in the newspaper. So I'm not sure that the older guys all had full beards still, but I'm guessing they probably did. Crosby was supposed to have gotten one of the largest vote margins ever received as a candidate for mayor. he was selected. He was the guy who became the collector of customs. In fact, the last collector of customs for the Bath District. In 1913, the Bath District and all other Maine districts were merged into Portland. And so Bath from that time had an office only with a deputy collector. Harry Donnell will have to serve as an example of one of the guys who did not become a collector. He was actually destined for disappointment in a number of areas of his life. He was the eldest son of a shipbuilder, William T. Donnell, and he was expected to take over the family shipyard, and he wanted to, and he tried to. He actually built a couple of vessels, three-mast schooners, in the early 1890s, but he, well, the shipbuilding business was going out, and the family shipyard closed after building a vessel in 1896. So Harry went on to other things. He managed the Alameda Hall downtown for some years. He managed a roller polo team. He was briefly a naval officer for just a few months during the Spanish-American War. And he was lucky to spend 20 years as a deputy collector in the Bath Customs Office before retiring to run a chicken and egg business out of his rather grand house on High Street. In 1911, Collector Crosby was able to persuade the federal government to expand the Customs House. And it was still called the Customs House, even though the post office had become very large, and probably more people were employed there than were employed in the Customs Office. So they took down the east wall of the building and they moved it east and added 3 extra windows, so doubled the size of the building. And here we have a plan of the upstairs that used to be all Customs Office territory. And there's starting to be some inroads now. You can see, I showed you that picture of the inside of the customs room. Here's part of that counter with a slightly different configuration here. And there's an inspector's office here and a special deputy collector's office here. And then 2 offices for the collector. Mr. Crosby maintains his river view here. But then there's a law library with an IRS office and a surgeon. There's an acting assistant surgeon now, and this room is a venereal disease clinic. So the Marine Hospital has sort of devolved into a venereal disease clinic. Otherwise, this layout is very similar to what it is today. Here's the stairs you come up today, and you walk across this corridor and go through the door that says Customs Office on it. The lobby at this point in 1911 assumed it's sort of the general appearance that it still had in the 60s and 70s. The post office moved to their new facility, I think in 1976. So the expansion of the building led to the appearance of the Customs Office as we see it in this photograph. Generally, the duties of the customs officers were getting smaller as the 20th century went on. Fewer vessels were being built in the Kennebec, and fewer voyages were starting or ending in the district. But there was one additional duty, which was when the Brunswick Naval Air Station was created. There were sometimes international flights arriving there that had to be met by the Bath deputy collector, as well as the health officer and the immigration officer from Portland. So the office survived until 1973. That year, I actually saw this counter in this location that year. Some of the records of the office came to the Maine Maritime Museum. Most of the records went to the National Archives, or probably had gone long before '73. So that's the end. Thank you for listening. I would be happy to accept questions.